It is 7:46 in the evening on the last Friday of July, and in the hills above Naples, the ground simply stops behaving like ground. For 3, 4, 5 seconds, the earth beneath one of the most densely populated volcanic regions on the planet convulses with a violence it has not shown in 40 years. Balconies crack, facades peel away from apartment buildings and crash into the street below. A cliff face crumbles into the sea near Pozzuoli. 26 people are injured, 2 of them seriously, and by the time the shaking stops, something has changed that cannot be undone by daylight or by reassurance. A threshold has been crossed. And underneath the city of 500,000 people who call this region home, something ancient has just reminded everyone that it is still awake. This is Campi Flegrei, the Phlegraean fields, the burning fields, and if you have never heard of it before tonight, you are about to understand why the scientists who study it choose their words more carefully than almost anyone else on Earth. Because Campi Flegrei is not a mountain. It has no dramatic snow-capped peak, no single crater you could point a camera at and say, there, that is the volcano. It does not look like danger. It looks like a sunny stretch of Italian coastline, dotted with pastel apartment blocks, cafes, marinas, and Roman ruins, half swallowed by the sea. Tourists sunbathe on beaches that sit directly inside its collapsed crater. Children play soccer in a stadium built into the rim of an ancient explosion. Commuters ride a metro line that tunnels straight through rock formed by eruptions most of them have never heard of. And that is precisely what makes it one of the most quietly terrifying geological features on the planet. Campi Flegrei is not a volcano you can see. It is a caldera, a vast, shallow depression roughly 12 kilometers across, the scar left behind by an eruption so catastrophic that scientists still argue about how close it came to reshaping the fate of an entire continent. To understand what just happened and what might happen next, you have to go back. Not decades, not centuries. Back roughly 39,000 years to an eruption known today as the Campanian Ignimbrite. It was, by some estimates, one of the largest volcanic events of the last 100,000 years anywhere on the planet, releasing an amount of magma so vast that comparing it to Pompeii, or even to Krakatoa, barely begins to capture the scale. It didn't just reshape southern Italy. It threw so much ash and sulfur into the atmosphere that some researchers believe it contributed to a volcanic winter across Europe and Asia, a cooling event that some link to the decline of Neanderthal populations already under pressure from a changing world. Whether or not that link holds up to scrutiny is still fiercely debated among archaeologists. What is not debated is the scale of the blast. It emptied a magma chamber so large that the ground above it collapsed inward, forming the caldera that 500,000 people now live inside, most of them with no daily thought given to what lies beneath their feet. The ancients, though, sensed something was wrong with this ground long before anyone understood plate tectonics or magma chambers. The Greeks and Romans who settled this coastline believed the sulfurous, steaming crater at Solfatara was one of the entrances to the underworld itself. Virgil sent Aeneas down through a cave near here to speak with the dead. The Cumean Sibyl delivered her prophecies from a grotto carved into rock that was still, geologically speaking, breathing. They built temples and bathhouses over natural steam vents, worshipped gods of fire and forge in a landscape that hissed and bubbled around them, and somehow, across centuries of Roman prosperity, never saw the region erupt in any way large enough to threaten the empire. It simply smoked and rumbled and waited. Campi Flegrei erupted again after the great blast of 39,000 years ago. Smaller events spread across thousands of years, each one leaving its own layer in the rock for geologists to read like tree rings. The most recent one happened in 1538, when a new hill, Monte Nuovo, rose out of the ground in a matter of days, not weeks, days. An eruption violent enough to bury a village and permanently reshape the coastline, but small compared to what came before it. Contemporary accounts describe the ground swelling visibly for 2 full days before the eruption began, cracking open, hissing steam, driving terrified residents from their homes before a single drop of lava appeared. It was, in miniature, a preview of the exact warning signs scientists are watching for again today. Since 1538, for nearly 500 years, the region has been quiet, not silent. Quiet. And quiet, for a caldera like this, is a very different thing from safe. Because starting in 2005 and accelerating sharply since 2023, the ground at Campi Flegrei began to rise. Scientists call this bradycism, a slow breathing motion of the Earth's crust, driven by hot fluids and gases shifting somewhere beneath the surface. Since the current episode of unrest began, the ground near Pozzuoli has lifted by more than 140 centimeters. That is not a subtle shift. That is the Earth visibly, measurably rising beneath an entire city, month after month, year after year, like something enormous is slowly inhaling. Building foundations have cracked from the strain. Seawalls built for a certain water level now sit measurably higher than the tides they were designed for. Engineers have had to reassess infrastructure across the red zone simply to account for ground that will not stay where it was surveyed. And with the uplift has come the earthquakes. Not one dramatic swarm, but a rising tide of them. Tens of thousands of tremors have been recorded in the region since 2022 alone, the overwhelming majority too small to feel, but each one a data point in a pattern that has been trending in one direction. More frequent, more clustered, in some cases, deeper. Seismologists retrained machine learning models just to keep up with the volume, mapping nearly 50,000 individual quakes to understand exactly where and how the stress is accumulating along the ring faults that trace the edge of the ancient caldera. What those maps reveal is not comforting. The earthquakes are increasingly concentrated in shallow urban zones, directly beneath neighborhoods, rather than scattered harmlessly offshore or deep underground. Then came July 31st, 2026, a magnitude 4.7 earthquake centered near the Solfatara crater in Pozzuoli, the strongest instrumentally recorded shock in the history of monitoring at Campi Flegrei, stronger even than the magnitude 4. 6 events that shook the region in 2025 and were, at the time, themselves called the strongest in 40 years. Within hours, more than 60 aftershocks followed. A magnitude 3 ate late that same night. A 3. 1 the next morning. Residents on the islands of Procida and Ischia, kilometers offshore, felt the ground move beneath them. Rail lines shut down across the Cumana and Circumflegrei networks. The port of Pozzuoli closed, cutting ferry access to the islands entirely, stranding tourists and residents alike in the middle of peak summer season. And across the red zone, the 15 towns and neighborhoods that Italian civil protection authorities have designated as being at greatest risk should the caldera ever fully wake. Families spent the night outside, in cars, in parks, anywhere that wasn't under a roof that might come down on them if the aftershocks kept building. Picture it for a moment. It is peak tourist season on the Bay of Naples. Hotel balconies are full, restaurant terraces are full, ferries are running back and forth to Capri and Ischia, packed with people who came here for sunsets and lemon groves and views of Vesuvius across the water, most of them with absolutely no idea they were standing inside the rim of something far older and far larger than the volcano they came to photograph. And then the ground moves, and for a few long seconds, everyone on that coastline, tourist and local alike, is given the exact same brutal geography lesson at the exact same time. This is the part of the story where you need to hear two things at once, because both are true and neither cancels the other out. The first is this. Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, INGV, has been unambiguous. As of the most recent reporting, there are no signs of an imminent eruption. No magma has been detected rising toward the surface. The current activity, alarming as it is, fits within a recognized pattern of Brady seismic unrest. The slow inflation and seismic unrest, driven primarily by heat and pressurized fluids in the shallow hydrothermal system, not by magma forcing its way upward. This is the same broad process that has played out at Campi Flegrei before, including a seismic crisis in the early 1980s that displaced tens of thousands of residents from Pozzuoli, cracked open apartment blocks, and produced monthly uplift rates far higher than anything recorded today, without ever culminating in an eruption. An entire generation of Pozzuoli residents grew up being evacuated, resettled in new housing further from the crater, and then, eventually, watching the crisis fade for 2 decades before it began creeping back. The second thing you need to hear is this. Nobody, not INGV, not the Italian government, not any volcanologist studying this caldera, is willing to say that pattern is guaranteed to hold. Because the uplift keeps climbing. The earthquakes keep clustering. And every new strongest in decades earthquake has, without exception, been followed within a year or two by an even stronger one. The 2025 record didn't stand. Neither, most seismologists would tell you privately, is the 2026 record likely to be the last one broken. Some researchers have gone further, publishing analysis suggesting the caldera's crust may be approaching a point of mechanical failure, not necessarily an eruption, but a structural threshold beyond which the rock itself can no longer simply stretch and creak the way it has for the past 2 decades. What happens on the other side of that threshold is precisely what nobody can say with confidence. So what actually happens next? Not in some distant hypothetical future, in the weeks and months immediately ahead, and in the range of outcomes scientists are genuinely watching for. The most immediate risk isn't a Campanian Ignimbrite scale eruption. It's something closer to the ground and in some ways more insidious. Continued strong, shallow earthquakes, capable of collapsing already weakened buildings in a region where a huge share of the housing stock predates modern seismic codes by decades, in some cases by centuries. Civil Protection Minister Nello Musumeci has already warned publicly that earthquakes above magnitude 3 remain possible in the near term, and that the swarm is ongoing, not resolved. Each new aftershock chips away further at structures already cracked by the July 31st shock. Engineers moving through Pozzuoli in the days after the main quake have been triaging buildings the way medics triage patients, marking which structures are safe to re-enter, which need repair before anyone goes back inside, and which need to be condemned outright. In a densely built urban area of 500,000 people, that alone is a serious and escalating hazard, independent of what the volcano itself ultimately does. Beyond that sits a second, more specific danger that gets far less attention than eruption headlines, but that many volcanologists consider the more immediate concern at Campi Flegrei right now, a hydrothermal explosion. Picture superheated water and gas trapped under pressure in shallow rock beneath the solfatara and the wider caldera, finding a sudden pathway to the surface. It doesn't require fresh magma. It doesn't require the kind of deep unrest that would trigger a full volcanic eruption. It can happen with little to no warning, blasting rock, steam, and mud into the air, with enough force to injure or kill anyone standing nearby, on a hiking trail, in a parking lot, on a street that looked, moments earlier, completely ordinary. Smaller hydrothermal explosions have already been documented at Campi Flegrei in recent years, some barely making international news despite scattering debris across popular tourist paths near the crater. As the ground keeps rising and pressure keeps building in that shallow hydrothermal system, the odds of a larger one only increase. And unlike a magmatic eruption, a hydrothermal blast can arrive with almost no advance warning at all. And then there's the scenario nobody wants to say out loud, but that the entire multi-billion-euro emergency planning apparatus around Naples exists because of a genuine magmatic eruption. If, and this is very much an if, magma from depth were to begin forcing its way upward, seismologists expect the warning signs to escalate well beyond what's being recorded now. A shift from green to yellow to red on Italy's volcanic alert scale. A sharp acceleration in the rate and depth of earthquakes, moving from the shallow crust down toward the magma reservoir, believed to sit several kilometers below the surface. Ground deformation measured not in centimeters per year, but suddenly, alarmingly, in centimeters per week. New gas emissions, particularly shifts in the ratio of carbon dioxide to sulfur dioxide, venting from the solfatara, which scientists treat as an early fingerprint of magma approaching the surface. Changes in the temperature and chemistry of fumaroles across the caldera. None of that has been observed yet. But it's precisely because everyone knows how fast a bradyseismic crisis could theoretically tip into something else that Italy has, for years now, maintained detailed contingency plans to evacuate the entire red zone, more than 500,000 people, inside a window measured in days, not weeks. That evacuation plan is not theoretical paperwork sitting in a government drawer. It has been rehearsed. Authorities have run large-scale drills simulating the movement of hundreds of thousands of residents out of the red zone by road, rail, and sea, coordinating buses, checkpoints, and reception centers across neighboring regions of southern Italy. The plan divides the danger zone into sectors, each assigned specific evacuation routes and timelines, designed so that a coastal population larger than many small countries could, in theory, be moved to safety before a worst-case eruption began in earnest. Whether that plan could actually function at full scale, under real panic, with real traffic, real families refusing to leave pets or elderly relatives behind, real ferries overloaded beyond capacity, is a question that has never been answered by anything other than a drill. It is one thing to evacuate a coastline on a calm Tuesday morning as part of a scheduled exercise. It is another thing entirely to do it while the ground is shaking. The news is spreading in real time across phones and television screens, and the people responsible for keeping order are also, quietly, terrified themselves. Even a modest eruption, on the scale of Monte Nuovo in 1538, would today unfold in one of the most densely populated volcanic landscapes on Earth. Where farmland and a single fishing village once stood, there are now hospitals, highways, a metro system, a naval base, refineries, and the entire western edge of metropolitan Naples. A far larger event, anything approaching what geologists see written into the ash layers from thousands of years ago, is considered extremely unlikely on any near-term timescale. But extremely unlikely soon and impossible are not the same sentence, and that gap is exactly where INGV's monitoring stations, GPS sensors, tilt meters, and seismic networks are working around the clock right now, watching for the difference between a caldera that is breathing and a caldera that is waking up. It helps, too, to put Campi Flegrei beside the other giants of this kind scattered across the planet, if only to understand why volcanologists watch this particular one so closely. Yellowstone, in the United States, sits under constant seismic monitoring of its own, recording dozens of small earthquakes most months, and yet its most recent updates describe activity firmly at background levels, with deformation and seismicity showing no signs of unusual escalation. Long Valley Caldera in California and the ancient Toba caldera in Indonesia, site of an eruption so large it may have bottlenecked the entire human species roughly 70,000 years ago, both site largely dormant, monitored but quiet. What sets Campi Flegrei apart from nearly all of them isn't necessarily its size. It's the combination of documented accelerating unrest happening in real time and a resident population in the hundreds of thousands living directly inside the hazard zone. Yellowstone's nearest major city is hours away. Campi Flegrei's danger zone includes suburbs of one of Europe's largest metropolitan areas. For the people actually living through this, the science is almost secondary to the daily calculation of ordinary life. Do you sleep in your apartment tonight or in the car again? Do you send your children to school in a building that engineers haven't yet finished inspecting? Do you sell a home you've owned for decades in a market where prices in the red zone have been quietly falling for years as buyers grow more cautious? Or do you stay because this is where your family has always lived, where your parents lived, where the streets and the church and the market are woven into who you are? Real estate agents in Pozzuoli describe a slow, steady exodus of buyers unwilling to gamble on the caldera, even as many longtime residents insist they have survived unrest before and will survive it again. Both instincts are rational. Both are being tested right now in real time by a piece of ground that refuses to give a clear answer either way. Behind the scenes, the monitoring effort keeping watch over all of this is one of the most sophisticated volcanic surveillance networks on the planet, and it has to be, given what's at stake. Dozens of seismic stations ring the caldera, feeding data into INGV's control room in near real time, flagging even the smallest tremors within seconds of occurrence. GPS receivers bolted to bedrock across the region track ground movement down to the millimeter, turning the invisible act of the Earth breathing into a continuous, readable graph. Tilt meters buried beneath the surface measure the subtlest changes in the angle of the ground itself, catching signals that might otherwise be lost in the noise of a busy, earthquake-prone city. Gas sensors positioned across the Solfatara and along fracture lines sample the chemistry of what's escaping from underground almost continuously, watching for the specific shift in gas ratios that has, at other volcanoes around the world, preceded magma's final push toward the surface. Satellite radar passes overhead on a regular schedule, capable of detecting ground deformation across the entire caldera in a single sweep, catching anything the ground stations might miss. None of this technology can tell scientists with certainty what happens next. What it can do is shrink the blind spot, buying precious hours or days of warning in a scenario where hours and days could be the difference between an orderly evacuation and a catastrophe measured in the tens of thousands. And still, for all of that technology, the fundamental uncertainty at the heart of this story hasn't gone away. Volcanology is not a science of certainties. It is a science of probabilities, of pattern recognition, of reading a system that has only fully erupted a handful of times in recorded human history, none of them captured by modern instruments. Every model INGV runs, every threshold they've set for moving the alert level from green to yellow, is built on incomplete data, informed guesswork stacked on top of genuine expertise. That is not a criticism of the scientists involved, most of whom have devoted entire careers to understanding this exact caldera. It is simply the nature of trying to predict the behavior of something that last did what everyone fears it might do again nearly 500 years ago, and that, before that, did something almost unimaginably larger 39,000 years before anyone was there to measure it. They are, in a very real sense, trying to forecast the mood of a giant that has only spoken a handful of times across the entire span of human civilization, and every one of those handful of times it spoke differently. What makes the current moment feel different to many of the people who have studied Campi Flegrei for decades isn't any single earthquake, even one as strong as July 31st's. It's the trajectory. 2 decades of steady, accelerating uplift. A seismic rate that keeps setting new records rather than settling into a stable plateau. A hydrothermal system that keeps venting more gas at higher temperatures than it did 5 years ago. None of these signs, taken alone, points definitively toward an eruption. Together, they describe a system under sustained building stress, one that has not yet found a way to safely release that pressure the way it did through the smaller earthquakes and slow venting of past decades. Whether that stress eventually resolves the way it did in the 1980s, fading gradually over years without further incident, or whether it continues building towards some threshold nobody has fully mapped, is the single question hanging over 500,000 people who go to sleep tonight in the shadow of a caldera that used to be famous, mostly for its ruins and its sunsets. For now, the official assessment holds it green. Background unrest, elevated, but not signaling imminent eruption. The people of Pozzuoli, Bagnoli, and the 15 towns of the red zone go back into buildings they aren't entirely sure are safe, because the alternative, sleeping outside indefinitely, isn't a life either. Scientists keep watching the uplift numbers tick upward month after month, year after year. A slow-motion countdown with no confirmed end date and no guarantee it ends the way anyone fears. And somewhere beneath one of the most beautiful, most populated, and most quietly dangerous stretches of coastline in Europe, whatever is driving this now 500-year cycle of unrest continues, indifferent to how carefully anyone above it is watching. There's a particular kind of dread that comes from living somewhere the danger cannot be seen. A hurricane gives you days of warning, a spinning shape on a satellite map, a clear countdown to landfall. A wildfire announces itself with smoke on the horizon long before it reaches your street. Campi Flegrei offers no such clarity. It offers a graph that keeps climbing, a number of earthquakes per month that keeps growing, a government minister choosing his words with visible care on television, and beneath all of it, the unshakable knowledge that the ground itself, the thing every single structure in Naples is built upon, cannot be trusted to simply stay where it is. That is the particular psychological weight carried by everyone in the red zone right now, whether they say it out loud or not the certainty of disaster, the impossibility of ruling it out. The truth is, Campi Flegrei has done this before. It rose, it shook, it frightened an entire region. And then, for a while, it went quiet again, right up until the next time the ground remembered it hadn't finished rising yet. Whether this is one more chapter in that long, slow, centuries-spanning breath, or the beginning of something the history books haven't written yet, is a question that not even the scientists standing closest to it are willing to answer. All anyone can do is watch the numbers, brace for the next aftershock, listen for the sound the ground makes right before it decides to move again, and wait, together with 500,000 people who have nowhere else in the world they would rather call home, to see what the ground beneath Naples finally decides to do next.